You're listening to Silent Crime Stories. Tonight, we step into the shadows once more, into a story that someone somewhere tried to keep buried. Pull up a chair, turn off the lights, and listen closely, because every detail matters. Chicago, the summer of 1893. The city is gripped by a fever unlike anything it has known since the Great Fire. A joyous, triumphant, collective fever, because something impossible has been built here. An exhibition meant to prove to the world that America has come of age, that it is no longer a pioneer project at the edge of civilization, but a society capable of rivaling European antiquity and European splendor. The Columbian Exposition, opened in May 1893 on the grounds of Jackson Park, drew more than 20 million visitors across its run. 20 million people who came by train from every corner of the continent, with their luggage and their children, and their eyes wide open to wonders they had never seen. Electric lights, mechanical rides, buildings of steel and stucco that looked like palaces from another world. The city was heaving. Hotels were full. Boarding houses took in more guests than they could hold. The streets between Michigan Avenue and the lakeshore were thick with people who had come for the first time and knew no one and knew nothing, except that it was beautiful here, and that they wanted to see everything. At the corner of 63rd Street and South Wallace Avenue stood a building that locals had taken to calling the castle. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was above all large, 3 stories of brick and timber, with a facade imposing enough to inspire a certain respect, and with an interior arrangement that no outsider could fully understand, because the owner constantly rotated construction crews, dismissing some, hiring others, personally supervising each stage with a careful, vigilant eye. The building had a shop on the ground floor, hotel rooms on the upper floors, and offices and spaces whose purpose could not be determined from outside or from the corridor. The owner of the building was a man who had the gift of making everyone around him feel special. Women, and there were many, so very many, said he was charming in a way they had never encountered before. That he listened as if what you were saying was the most important thing in the world. That he made you feel seen. That summer, tens of thousands of women passed through Chicago alone. Secretaries, shop girls, students, daughters from the provinces who had come to see the fair or to find work, or both. Women who had no one here, who were free in the particular way that only a great city makes you free. Free and invisible, and susceptible to the appeal of a man who knows how to make you feel, suddenly and completely, like the only one. Henry Howard Holmes knew how to be that man, and he knew what to do afterward. Herman Webster Mudgett, for that was his real name, the one he came into the world with on the 16th of May, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, was not a child born into poverty or domestic violence, though criminologists spent years searching his biography for those classic markers of a troubled beginning. His family was Methodist, strict, rooted in provincial New England with its Puritan work ethic and small-town rhythms. His father was an alcoholic, which introduces a darker note, but even that is not a clear explanation for what Herman Mudgett would become. What grew in him was intellectually extraordinary. Mudgett was a gifted child in ways that drew attention. He learned quickly, read quickly, had a photographic memory and a capacity for concentration that allowed him to sink into subjects with an intensity unsettling for his age. One of those subjects which consumed him earlier than it should have was anatomy. The human body as object, its structure, its interior, the way parts fit together, and the ways in which they cease to fit when something goes wrong. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, because Holmes enjoyed telling things about himself that hovered at the boundary between fact and invention. About the day the boy wandered into a doctor's office and saw an anatomical skeleton. That instead of fleeing, he stood and looked. That something in that cold, precise image of human structure gave him a peace that nothing else could give him. Whether this is true is uncertain. What is certain is that anatomy became his obsession early, and that the obsession was not academic. He was bullied as a child, and that information carries its own psychological weight, though it determines nothing in a simple, mechanical way. Bullying is an experience that shapes different people differently. It breaks some, hardens others, and turns some into people who spend the rest of their lives seeking revenge for a humiliation they carried too long. Holmes belonged to the last category, with the qualification that his revenge was not directed at specific tormentors, but at the world as an abstraction, and that his methods were far more refined than simple vengeance. Medical school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor was an ideal environment for Mudgett, because it gave him access to what he had always sought: bodies. Human material that could be worked with, examined, dissected, analyzed, and that could be used for other purposes. Because already during his studies, sometime between 1882 and 1884, Herman Mudgett found a way to profit from what he had at hand. He stole human remains from the anatomy laboratory, then sold them to insurance companies as the bodies of fictitious accident victims for whom he had previously taken out policies. Insurance fraud was his first crime. Not murder, but manipulation of the system. It foreshadowed everything that was to come. When he left Michigan with a medical degree, which he had obtained mainly to have a title because practicing medicine did not interest him the way access to bodies did, he changed his name. Herman Webster Mudgett became Henry Howard Holmes. The name was a mask. The mask worked perfectly. Chicago in the 1880s and 1890s was a city in a state of ferment that could be described in a single word: opportunity. Opportunity was everywhere. In trade, in construction, in industry, in services. The city was growing so fast that the right hand never knew what the left was doing. Regulations were loose, oversight was diffuse, and a man's identity was whatever he said it was. Because who had time to check? Holmes understood this city instinctively. He understood that it was an environment made for someone like him, someone capable of rapid adaptation, someone who could project different impressions in different situations, someone with sufficient intelligence to stay one step ahead of others, and someone unconstrained by what most people call a conscience. His first years in Chicago were a succession of small and medium-sized frauds. Pharmacists he cheated of medicines and equipment, employers he left with unpaid debts, women he entered into relationships with for the purpose of extracting money or signatures on financial documents. He was a bigamist. He married without having divorced his previous wife and did so at least 3 times. But bigamy was then a crime difficult to prosecute in a country so vast and so poorly connected that changing cities was effectively changing identities. In 1886, Holmes came to the pharmacy at the corner of 63rd and Wallace, run by a man named Holton. Mr. Holton was ill. Mrs. Holton needed help. Holmes offered to manage the business and help through a difficult time. And he was so helpful, so competent, so understanding and agreeable that Mrs. Holton did not notice the moment when she ceased to be the owner and became someone else's guest. What became of Mrs. Holton is a question with no certain answer. Holmes told different people different things: that she had moved away, that she had died of illness, that she had gone to live with relatives. No one knew her well enough to press for verification. Holmes was already the owner of the lot and was planning construction. The building Holmes erected at the corner of 63rd and Wallace between 1887 and 1893 was one of the most remarkable architectural projects in American history. Not for its aesthetic or engineering merit, but for what it was designed to do. From the outside, it appeared to be an ordinary, functional commercial and hotel building. The ground floor was given over to shops and the pharmacy. The upper floors held hotel rooms, offices, and apartments that Holmes rented or offered rent-free to women with whom he maintained various relationships. The facade was solid enough to inspire trust and unremarkable enough not to attract too much attention. Inside, and this is the element that has gripped the imagination for more than 100 years, it was different. Holmes built the building by rotating construction crews with regular, non-random frequency. No crew worked long enough to understand the whole project. Each saw its fragment, its floor, its corridor, its room. Holmes himself oversaw the entirety, and only he knew how the fragments fit together into a single image. This was methodical, deliberate action, demonstrating that the building had a hidden function from the beginning, and not that Holmes modified it gradually on impulse. Secret passages connected hotel rooms to other spaces in ways invisible to guests. Some rooms had doors that locked from the outside and could not be opened from within. There were rooms without windows into which no natural light reached. There was a shaft connecting the upper floors to the basement, narrow, vertical, sufficient to send something, or someone, down without leaving traces on the staircase. In the basement stood a furnace too large and too airtight for ordinary building heat. And there was an operating table, surgical instruments, tanks of acid and lime. Holmes called it his castle. There was something self-aware in the name, something of the dark pride that is a feature of the narcissistic personality. Because builders of castles are kings, and kings have the right to everything that happens within their walls. The question of how many people died in this building is a question with no certain answer, one that has generated estimates ranging from a few to more than 200 over more than a century. Holmes himself, in a gesture characteristic of his manipulative nature, gave different numbers in different circumstances, as though the count of his victims were a currency subject to negotiation. At trial and shortly before his execution, he confessed to 27 murders, but historians and criminologists agree that this number is impossible to verify. Some of the victims he named were alive. Some of the deaths he admitted to could not be confirmed. The probable number of those killed, those whose deaths can be attributed to Holmes with any reasonable degree of certainty, falls somewhere between a handful and a dozen or so. But the building he constructed and its furnishings leave no doubt as to his intentions. Before the castle, there was the pharmacy. And that pharmacy, its daily life, its clientele, its rhythms, was the first stage on which Holmes rehearsed everything he would later apply at a larger scale. The pharmacy at the corner of 63rd and Wallace, which Holmes had taken over from the ailing Mrs. Holton, was a place of natural human circulation. Neighborhood women came in for medicines for their children. Men came with coughs and headaches. Elderly people arrived with prescriptions from doctors with whom Holmes was happy to collaborate, because doctors have information about their patients, and information has value. Holmes was courteous behind the counter, competent, always ready to advise, always remembering everyone's name and what had ailed them last time. The pharmacy was also where Holmes began to build a network of financial obligations to himself, issuing credit, signing supply contracts for goods he never paid for, ordering equipment from suppliers in different states, and giving suppliers something that looked like a check but proved to be something else. These techniques were tested and modified repeatedly, because Holmes had the capacity to learn from mistakes, though only in the technical sense, never the moral. When a given fraud scheme stopped working in one place, he moved to the next and applied a revised version. The pharmacy staff turned over frequently. Shop girls came and went, sometimes because they found better work, sometimes because something made them prefer to leave. One woman employed during this period later described how Holmes had a habit of inviting female employees upstairs under various pretexts, how the doors to those rooms were thick and absorbed sound, and how a particular shop girl with whom Holmes had been close for a time one day simply stopped coming to work, and none of her colleagues knew why. That woman does not appear in the official case files. Perhaps she lived and left. Perhaps not. It is one of the many shadows in this story that have no resolution. To understand Holmes as a killer, not as a legend, not as a character from a television series, but as a specific human being acting in a specific historical moment, one must understand how he functioned in relationships with women. Because women were his primary category of victim, and the mechanism he applied was refined and repeatable. Holmes was, in the most technical sense of the word, a seducer. Not in the romantic sense the word carries in ordinary usage. He was not a man who loved women, and his charm was the negation of love. He was a man who understood women as systems that could be configured if one knew the right levers, and he knew them perfectly. Women who entered his orbit typically described the same experience, the feeling of being seen. Holmes listened. He asked about details that other men ignored. He remembered, or gave the impression of remembering, things they had said a week before. He was interested in their plans, their dreams, their stories. In an era when women were generally treated by men as functional ornaments for running a household, Rather than as autonomous subjects with their own interior lives, the experience of being truly heard carried an enormous force of attraction. And he was handsome. Photographs of Holmes from that period show a man of regular features, impeccably dressed, with eyes that look directly into the lens with the confidence of someone who has nothing to hide. Because a truly accomplished liar never looks like one. Women who came to his hotel during the fair were often looking for work or temporary lodging. Holmes offered both. He employed them as secretaries, shop assistants, clerks. He gave them rooms, at low cost or free of charge. He built relationships with them structured as friendship or romance, depending on what each woman needed emotionally. And he gradually assumed control over their decisions, their assets, their documents. Some of these women came through it alive. Some, in all probability, though not with certainty for every name and every date, did not. Minna Belknap and Emmeline Sigrand, Julia Connor, Minnie Williams, and her sister Nanny. These are the names of women who appear in Holmes's case files, in witness testimony, in historical analyses. Each of them has her own story. Each of them had her own life before she encountered Holmes, and each of them underwent the same process. The slow drawing into the orbit of a man who knew precisely what he was doing. Julia Connor was the wife of a jeweler whom Holmes employed and then financially ruined. Julia herself became Holmes's lover and disappeared. Human remains were later discovered in the basement of the building that may have belonged to her or to her daughter Pearl. May have, because identification under the forensic conditions of that era was not achievable with certainty. Minnie Williams was a woman who had inherited properties in Texas and who came to know Holmes through an advertisement. She married him, not knowing that he was already married. She transferred ownership of her properties to him, and she disappeared. The Columbian Exposition of 1893 holds a particular place in American history because it was a triumph intended to eclipse Paris and its 1889 exposition, at which the Eiffel Tower had been erected to the dismay of many who considered it an aesthetic mistake. America wanted to answer with something equally impressive yet more beautiful. And the architects under Daniel Burnham's direction created the White City, a complex of neoclassical buildings in steel and stucco, bathed in electric light, surrounded by canals and fountains. It was something many visitors had never seen before and would never see again in their lives. In this context of triumph and optimism, of progress and modernity, of millions of eyes gazing at the wonder of civilization, Holmes operated as a shadow, as a negation, as a proof that every great illumination casts a proportionally great darkness at its edges. This is not a metaphor without substance. Geographically, the White City sat in Jackson Park, and Holmes's castle stood on 63rd Street, a 15-minute walk or short trolley ride from the main exposition gates. For a woman who had arrived in Chicago alone, who was looking for lodging or work, who wanted to see the fair but whose wallet could not stretch to a hotel near the center, Holmes's hotel was a logistical answer to a concrete need. It was close. It was affordable. The owner was pleasant. That juxtaposition, the fair as magnet, the castle as trap within 15 minutes of the magnet, is the central image of this story and remains the strongest element of its persistence in culture. Because it says something about how evil functions not in isolation, but in the immediate vicinity of good, how it exploits the inattention that good generates in its glow, how it is possible precisely where everything appears to be safe. Burnham, designing the White City, spoke of genius loci, of the spirit of place that architecture can create or destroy. Holmes understood this intuitively, though in inverted form. He built a building whose genius loci was turned inward, directed against those who entered it. The question everyone who studies the Holmes case asks, how was this possible for so long? How did a man operate a hotel for years through which hundreds of guests passed, killing some of them without a single neighbor, a single employee, a single local institution responding? The answer is layered, and every layer is unpleasant. First, the disappearances of women in late 19th century Chicago were not automatically treated as crimes. Women vanished, They moved to other cities, cut contact with their families, fled difficult domestic situations, sought new lives. In an era when communication was slow and expensive, and when an address was a piece of information easily lost, a disappearance was sad but not necessarily suspicious. The police maintained no central missing persons registry. Families from other states attempting to trace a daughter or sister last seen in Chicago ran into a bureaucratic and geographical wall that was nearly impassable. Second, Chicago was a city where crime flourished openly and everyone knew it. Gangsters, prostitutes, dishonest businessmen, corrupt police. This was the background against which Holmes operated, and this background made his activities less distinguishable than they would have been in a different environment. When everything around you is gray, one particular shade of gray draws no particular notice. Third, Holmes was skilled at managing information. He knew who to tell what. He knew when to leave a tip, when to invite someone for a drink, when to be absent, and when to be visible. He knew how to give the impression of a man with nothing to hide because that impression is the most effective form of concealment. There are also voices suggesting that some police officers may have known or suspected something, but that Holmes had his ways of maintaining their silence. There is no hard evidence for this. But the Chicago of that era was not a city in which such a suggestion sounds absurd. None of the stories woven through Holmes's biography is more bitter in its human dimension than the story of Benjamin Pitezel, a man who had for years been his helper, his accomplice, in some sense his friend. If that word can carry any meaning in the context of a relationship with Holmes. Pitezel was a man with his own troubles. He drank, was financially unstable, and his family life was chaotic. He was also capable enough to help Holmes with his numerous frauds and foolish enough or desperate enough not to see where that cooperation was leading him. The plan Holmes devised in 1894 was elegant in its shameless simplicity. Pitezel would fake his own death so that Holmes could defraud the Fidelity Mutual Insurance Company out of $10,000. A body was required, something that could be presented as Pitezel's corpse. Pitezel agreed to the plan, believing that the fiction would be arranged using some other body that Holmes would procure from his obscure sources. But Holmes had planned something different. In August 1894, Pitezel was found dead in a rented house in Philadelphia. The death appeared to be an accident, an unfortunate ignition from chemicals he had been working with. Holmes, who appeared at the scene as a credible friend and helper, identified the body as Pitezel's and helped complete the insurance paperwork. The payout was assured. No one asked whether Pitezel had already been dead before the fire. But Holmes was not finished with the husband. He persuaded Pitezel's wife, Carrie, that her husband had not truly died, that he was in hiding, that the plan had worked, and that now she needed to meet him. But the journey had to be secret, and the children had to travel separately so as not to arouse suspicion. Carrie, a woman submerged in grief and desperation, believed him. And for several months, Holmes led Pitezel's 3 children, Howard, Nellie, and Alice, across several states, from Boston through Toronto to Cincinnati and beyond, while Carrie traveled a separate route, believing she was about to reunite with her husband. The children never saw their father. Howard, Nellie, and Alice Pitezel died one by one. Howard was found in Indiana, his remains unearthed from the garden of a house Holmes had rented. Nellie and Alice were found in Toronto, packed together in a trunk where Holmes had fed gas through a pipe. This was the end. Not because Holmes had grown less careful, but because the head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who had been tracking Holmes's earlier frauds, connected the threads. And because a Philadelphia detective named Thomas Geyer began searching for the children, and found what he had not wanted to find. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894. Holmes's arrest is itself a psychological study because Holmes was not a man who breaks when caught. He was a man who, in the face of any situation, adjusts the mask. During interrogations, he was calm, courteous, precise. He answered questions in a way that looked like candor, but was its perfect imitation. He admitted to minor things to divert attention from serious ones. He suggested alternative explanations. He drew investigators into conversations that were pleasant and intellectually stimulating and led nowhere concrete. When sufficient evidence had been assembled, and assembling it took months because the cases were scattered across several states, because bodies had been concealed with care, because traces had been systematically erased, Holmes changed tactics. He began to talk. He confessed. But he confessed in a way that was itself another form of manipulation. Because the numbers he offered shifted depending on what he might negotiate, because portions of his testimony were impossible to verify, and because the entire confession had the structure of a performance rather than a genuine accounting. The newspapers bought his every word, literally, because Holmes sold his confessions for $10,000 to the Hearst Syndicate and wrote an autobiography in which he transformed facts into a narrative favorable to himself. He was one of the first criminals in American history to understand that crime has media value and that this value can be monetized. After Holmes's arrest, the building at 63rd and Wallace passed through the hands of journalists, policemen, and crowds of the curious before authorities sealed access to it. What was found inside, the shaft, the furnace, the operating table, surgical instruments, acid tanks, human remains in various states of decomposition, confirmed in large part what former employees and neighbors had said for years, and what had been dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. The building burned in 1895, shortly before the trial, under circumstances never fully explained. The fire destroyed most of the physical evidence. Whether this was coincidence is unknown. Holmes was in jail at the time, so the immediate perpetrator must have been someone else. But Holmes had confederates, had debts and obligations to various people, and had a habit of planning ahead. Today, a post office stands on that site. Nothing suggests the history of the place. No sign, no plaque. All that remains is literature, stories, memory, and a series of genealogical investigations that every few years attempt to establish how many people truly died in that building. Holmes's trial took place in Philadelphia in 1895 and concerned primarily the murder of Benjamin Petzel, because that was the crime best documented, with an identified body, an insurance motive, and a chain of circumstantial evidence dense enough to persuade a jury. Holmes began by defending himself, then accepted legal assistance, because self-representation in a criminal court requires skills that even Holmes did not possess in sufficient measure. His defense oscillated between technical challenges to the evidence and emotional appeals to the jury, in which he attempted to portray himself as a man tangled in circumstances rather than their architect. The jury did not deliberate long. Verdict: guilty. Sentence: death by hanging. Holmes spent his final months in prison in a manner fully consistent with his character. That is to say, productively and with the orientation of extracting from the situation the maximum that was possible. He sold interviews. He wrote. He received priests who tried to convert him and who left with the sense that they had conversed with someone who understood the concept of conversion better than they did, but who deployed it purely as a rhetorical instrument. On the 2nd of May, 1896, in Philadelphia, Herman Webster Mudgett, known as Henry Howard Holmes, was hanged. He was 34 years old. The execution did not proceed cleanly. The rope did not snap his neck immediately as it should, and Holmes suffocated for several minutes before the attending physician declared him dead. He was conscious to the end, at least so the witnesses maintained. Before his death, he made an unusual request. He wanted to be buried in a grave sealed tightly with concrete so that no one could exhume his body and sell it for anatomical study, just as he himself had once sold the bodies of others to insurance companies. The request was honored. There is something in this that is not irony, something heavier and harder to name. In the more than 120 years since Holmes's execution, a layer of myth has accumulated around him thicker and more vivid than that surrounding most historical criminal legends. Part of this legend originates in his own confessions, because Holmes understood that the story of himself was a product to be shaped. Part derives from the journalism of his era, which operated by the logic of sensation and salability rather than verification. Part comes from the books, films, and series that successive generations produced, drawing from earlier versions of the myth rather than from primary sources. The most influential contemporary version of the Holmes legend is Erik Larson's 2003 book, The Devil in the White City, which weaves the history of the Columbian Exposition together with Holmes's story in a parallel narrative of fascinating structure and unquestioned literary merit. Larson himself acknowledges that he is a writer rather than a historian, and that his reconstructions are grounded in historical documents but also include elements of narrative conjecture. This authorial honesty does not always accompany readers in their experience of the book, and as a result, many scenes from Larson's pages function in popular consciousness as historical facts, when they are hypotheses clothed in literary form. The number of Holmes's victims is frequently cited in popular accounts as 200 or more, a figure originating in sensational newspaper coverage from 1895 and regarded by every serious historian as vastly inflated. The probable number of killings that can be attributed to Holmes with significant confidence falls somewhere between a handful and a dozen or so. That number makes Holmes a serial murderer and one of the first documented in American history, but not an archdemon responsible for slaughter on a wartime scale. This distinction matters, not to diminish Holmes's crimes or their victims. Each of them was a human being who had a life and who lost that life under circumstances that are difficult to contemplate without a feeling of physical revulsion. But because the myth of an inflated victim count serves primarily the fascination with crime as spectacle rather than its understanding as a psychological and social phenomenon, Holmes, as a man who built a building for killing people and who did so for years, surrounded by dozens of people, none of whom understood what they were dealing with. That story is sufficiently devastating without the addition of fictional hundreds. Herman Webster Mudgett left behind nothing that was sincere. There is no letter, no conversation, no statement that can with any confidence be accepted as an authentic expression of what he thought and felt beneath the layer of performance. Even his confession, even his admissions, even his tears, because he wept, at least sometimes, at least in the presence of certain people, cannot be verified as genuine. This is the peculiarity of the Holmes case that sets it apart from other serial killers we write and speak about. We have no access to the man. We have access to the mask, and the mask is fascinating because it is beautiful and intelligent and multidimensional. But the mask is not a face. Criminologists who have analyzed Holmes from the perspective of contemporary diagnostics consistently point to traits corresponding to psychopathy in the clinical sense: an absence of emotional empathy, the capacity to imitate emotions without experiencing them, an egocentrism so severe as to preclude the possibility of genuine connection with another person, and a tendency to treat others as instruments for the realization of one's own ends. This is not retroactive diagnosis in the casual sense. It is a description of a behavioral pattern consistent across the whole of Holmes's biography, one that explains both his capacity for years of fraud and his capacity to kill without visible traces of remorse. Yet even this diagnostic framing is in some sense insufficient, because Holmes was more than a clinical pattern of symptoms. He was a man who lived for years among other people and was loved, respected, desired by them, who inspired trust, who had friends, genuine if one-sided, and who operated in an environment that enabled all of this, the environment of a great city in an era of weak institutions, weak communication, and weak social oversight. Chicago in the 1890s was a city in which one could disappear and could allow others to disappear. Holmes understood this quality and built his entire life upon it. The Holmes case returns every decade or so in a new form. A new book, a new series, a new podcast, a new attempt to explain who this man was and what it says about us that his story still will not let us sleep. The regularity of these returns is itself telling. We are fascinated by Holmes for several reasons simultaneously. First, because he was handsome and intelligent, and a crime committed by someone handsome and intelligent reads differently than one committed by someone who fits our imagined template of a monster. Holmes does not fit, and that failure of fit is an unease that does not subside. Second, because he operated against the backdrop of one of the most triumphant moments in American history. The Columbian Exposition was the White City, as it was known, a symbol of progress, optimism, modernity. Holmes operated in its shadow as something precisely opposite, as a darkness that the brightness did not eliminate, but which the brightness in fact supplied with material and cover. This juxtaposition carries a moral and philosophical weight that reaches beyond any individual criminal history. Third, and perhaps most importantly, because Holmes poses a question with no comfortable answer. How well can we know another person? The women who loved him did not see what we see with the benefit of 120 years and the full weight of the available facts. They saw a man who listened, who was present with them, who made them feel important. And what they saw was not purely illusion, because Holmes genuinely was present with them, genuinely did listen, genuinely did remember. Only all of it was instrumental. He was with them in order to use them. He listened because information has value. He remembered because memory is a tool. The question of how well we can know another person is a question every generation asks anew. One that the Holmes case poses in a particularly sharp and uncomfortable form. Herman Webster Mudgett lies under concrete at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania. His grave is sealed as he requested. Above it stands a modest headstone that does not tell the truth about who lies beneath it. Because how does one write an epitaph for a man whose entire life was something other than what he would have written about himself? Over the years, there have been theories that Holmes did not die on the gallows in 1896, that he escaped, that he substituted someone else, that he went on living under a new name in a new place. Because a legend of this magnitude cannot simply end with a death, because something like Holmes must continue, must be an ongoing presence and threat, not a closed chapter. In 2017, an exhumation was carried out and DNA analysis was performed on the remains in the grave. It confirmed Holmes's identity. He lies where he was supposed to lie, under concrete. And the women who died in the castle on 63rd Street, or those whose deaths we have reasonable grounds to suspect, lie elsewhere or nowhere, because their remains were dissolved, burned, destroyed in a way that was deliberate and systematic, and that had precisely this effect: that no trace of them would remain, that their deaths would have no address, that there would be no place to go and say, Julia was here, Minnie was here, something was here before someone took it away. We know their names, at least some of their names, and that is all that remains. Names and hypotheses, and a building that burned, and a post office that stands in its place, and a city that in the summer of 1893 was white and triumphant and full of 20 million people, none of whom knew what was happening at the corner of 63rd and Wallace. No one knew. That's all for tonight. But before you leave this darkness, take a moment. Every story you heard here really happened. Somewhere there are people who remember, who still can't sleep at night, who are still searching for answers. Crime is never just a story. It's someone's life that went terribly wrong, or was taken by someone who thought they would get away with it. And sometimes they do. But silence has a way of speaking, eventually. If this story made you feel something, leave a comment. Just one word. One sign that you were here, that you listened, that you remember, because that's what Silent Crime Stories is all about.